My name is Peter Dunn. In this video, I will use fantasy theme analysis to dissect one of President Trump's political speeches to examine what it reveals about shared consciousness and group identity. Many know fantasy only as a setting artists use to create interesting stories. Professor Ernest Borman of the University of Minnesota instead used the word fantasy to describe how real world narratives become the shared realities of individual people. This is part of Borman's broader communications philosophy called symbolic convergence theory. Symbolic convergence theory, or SCT, is one possible academic explanation for how individuals transform into unique and identifiable groups. Unlike other methods of categorization and identity, SCT proposes that groups form a shared consciousness through storytelling. What makes this theory so compelling is that it addresses how disparate, geographically separated people could share the same reality despite having no direct contact with one another. The key building block of SCT and shared realities is called fantasy themes. These are the dramatized interpretations found within a narrative that capture individuals' emotional attention. Once a fantasy theme captures enough attention and spreads to enough individuals, it undergoes a process called the fantasy chain. Much like the chain reaction of a nuclear reactor, this is when the fantasy theme takes on a life of its own. Eventually, by being spread through communication and eventual consensus, the process reaches a critical mass. At this point, true symbolic convergence, or the melding of individual worldviews into group consciousness and identity, takes place. Given the need for dramatized messaging to begin this process, political storytelling is one of the best materials to analyze using principles found within SCT. President Trump's 2017 inaugural address is a high quality artifact to see these concepts play out in real time. Specifically, what makes this speech interesting is how many of the themes found within do not try and create new or expand pre existing worldviews. Rather, the goal of the speech is to resonate specifically with his supporters and reinforce their established symbolic realities. The most dominant fantasy theme, or master analog, found in this speech revolves around the notion that his audience was neglected and forgotten by those in power. This subject perfectly demonstrates the three components that are typically used to identify fantasy themes in the first place: setting, characters, and plotline. Embellished scenery, such as when he says, quote, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, end quote, set the scene. Likewise, the narrative is told in a way that shows ordinary Americans as heroes while the political elites are the villains, fulfilling the character requirement. Finally, the plotline is framed as a classic story of suffering and saviors. The spark that this group uses to recall this fantasy, aka the symbolic cue, can be summed up by the emphasized phrase, forgotten men and women, end quote. This phrase is the idea This phrase and the idea it represents reactivates the emotions for people who identify with the overall narrative whenever they hear it. Evidence that the fantasy theme chained outside the speech itself is apparent. Many Trump friendly outlets echoed this mentality following the speech, particularly on social media. Even non Trump aligned news agencies touted this as a defining moment of the year, such as in NBC's article 2017 in Review. Here are the top 10 biggest news stories. The most impactful narratives, however, rarely use just one fantasy theme to achieve their intended reality. Rather, they use themes that influence and build off each other, creating a much stronger and cohesive narrative known as a rhetorical vision. Trump's 2017 speech is no exception to this process. It uses multiple themes that all take inspiration from and reinforce each other to create a unified and resilient account of life. For example, when taking the first theme at face value, a question forms, one which Trump addresses in a second fantasy theme. This question is if we were neglected and forgotten, who exactly perpetrated that crime? The answer forms the basis of the second fantasy theme found within Trump's speech, namely, that the people are victims of the country's elite. This position was captured most clearly in the speech, around 2 minutes in, with the lines, quote, "For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the reward of government, while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth." End quote. Once again, all three fantasy-themed components are present. The setting is a corrupt Washington, D.C., the characters remain the same as the master analog, and the plotline shows deliberate negligence from those in charge. All these elements mimic or closely echo the characteristics present in the previous theme, therefore showcasing them as a unified fact. The symbolic cue for this theme is the repeated representation of Washington. Washington or its facsimiles are used throughout the speech to describe everything that has gone wrong with America. This elicits an emotional response from his listeners that the system is rigged whenever they hear of Washington or the government. This positioned Trump as an inside ally with his people while being opposed to and separate from the structure that led to his supporters' troubles. An example of this narrative chaining into the broader populace can be seen in the motto of his campaign, "Make America Great Again." This motto plays into the plot that the country is weakened because of Washington, and has subsequently been displayed by countless people across all forms of media. Ultimately, what SCT describes, and Trump's speech gives evidence for, is that group identities are not static or predetermined. Instead, whether they succeed or not, they are actively constructed by those hoping to harness storytelling to multiply their own worldviews for their own goals. Thank you very much.